A powerful billionaire used his influence to falsely accuse his loyal maid of stealing a priceless family heirloom, a crime she didn't commit. With help from a corrupt judge, he made sure she was sentenced to 15 years in prison, without real evidence, without a fair trial. Everyone believed she was guilty, until the billionaire's own 8-year-old son began to question what really happened. What the boy discovered would expose a web of lies, shake the justice system, and change all of their lives forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Lancaster woke up early that morning, as he usually did on important days. He had a major event planned at the Lancaster estate, a private gathering with a group of wealthy investors. Everything needed to be perfect. Richard wanted to impress them, not just with his wealth and projects, but with the history and power behind the Lancaster family name. He walked through the wide hallways of his mansion, checking every detail. The garden was in shape, the staff was ready, and the kitchen had started preparing the finest dishes. Before meeting the guests, Richard decided to take a moment for himself and went into the house library. This room was very special to him. It was filled with memories, rare books, and expensive collectibles. His most important possession, though, was a gold pocket watch sitting inside a glass case. It once belonged to his father and symbolized everything his family had built. When Richard entered the library, he walked straight to the glass case to look at the watch, like he often did before big moments. But this time, something was wrong. The case was open, and the gold watch was gone. At first, he thought he was mistaken. He looked around, thinking maybe someone had moved it for cleaning or repairs, but there was no note, no sign of where it had gone. Richard's heart started racing. The watch had never left that spot. It was one of a kind. He immediately called for his staff. The security team, maids and assistants all gathered as he asked them who had been in the library that morning. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Everyone said they had been busy preparing for the event. Richard asked again, this time louder, more aggressively. He was shocked and furious. This was not just a missing object. It was a personal and emotional loss. After speaking with several members of the staff, Richard learned that only one person had entered the library that morning: Emily, the housekeeper. She had gone in to dust the furniture and clean the floors, something she did every day. Richard called her immediately. Emily appeared confused and nervous. She had been working for the Lancaster family for several years and had never been in trouble before. When Richard asked her directly about the watch, she looked surprised. She said she hadn't even noticed the glass case and that she didn't touch anything. Her voice was shaky, but her words were clear. She insisted she would never steal from the family. She tried to explain, but Richard was not interested in listening. His emotions were too strong. He believed she was lying, and that hurt him even more. He had trusted her, and now he felt betrayed. Richard didn't want to wait for an investigation or any kind of official process. He made a quick and final decision. He accused Emily of stealing the gold watch. He claimed she had done it out of greed, thinking she could take something valuable and get away with it. Emily's face turned pale. She tried to speak, but Richard wouldn't let her finish a sentence. He was too angry to hear her side. He told her she had taken something that could never be replaced, not because of its price, but because of what it meant. The watch reminded him of his father, of childhood moments, of long talks about the business. He felt that all of it had been disrespected. The other staff watched silently. No one dared to speak in her defense. Richard was the boss, and when he was in this state, no one could change his mind. Emily was told to leave the house immediately. A guard was sent to escort her off the property. She walked out in silence, trying not to cry. She looked back at the mansion once before the gate closed behind her. She couldn't believe what had just happened. There had been no proof, no chance to explain. Her job, her home, and her reputation were all taken from her in minutes. Richard, still furious, ordered that the police be contacted. He wanted a full report filed and an investigation started. He also demanded that extra security cameras be installed, even though there were already many in the house. He didn't trust anyone anymore. To him, the betrayal had already happened. In his mind, Emily was guilty, and no one could convince him otherwise. He felt alone, angry, and more protective than ever of everything his family had left him. As the day went on, the guests arrived, unaware of the drama that had taken place earlier. Richard tried to hide his emotions and focus on the event. He welcomed everyone, gave speeches, and talked about the future of the Lancaster Empire. But his mind kept drifting back to the missing watch. The empty space in the glass case felt like a hole in his heart. Emily was gone, but the problem was not solved. The watch had not been found, and no one else had any answers. Despite the fancy food, music, and expensive suits, something was broken inside the house. Richard stood near the library at the end of the night, staring at the empty spot where the watch used to be. He felt proud, angry, and deeply sad all at once. And with that, the tragedy had begun, though no one truly realized how far it would go. After the incident with the missing watch, Richard Lancaster did not waste time. He wanted results fast. Using his money and contacts, he made some phone calls to people in the justice system. Richard had powerful connections, including Judge Howard, a longtime friend from his early days in politics. Within hours, Richard managed to organize a private trial. He made it clear to everyone involved that this was an urgent matter. He wanted to close the case and send a message that stealing from him had consequences. Richard told the authorities that Emily had broken his trust and betrayed the family. He didn't care that there was no real investigation. His pride was hurt, and that was enough for him. People around him felt pressure to go along with everything. No one wanted to challenge Richard. His influence was strong, and it made things move faster than they should have. Emily was arrested and taken away before she even had time to understand what was happening. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer, and no one from the Lancaster estate tried to help her. In a matter of days, she was standing in a courtroom, scared and confused. Everything around her felt wrong. The courtroom was filled with people who didn't look at her with respect. She had no one by her side to speak for her or protect her rights. A public defender was assigned to her, but he barely knew her name and didn't seem interested in her story. She tried to explain herself, saying she never touched the watch, but no one paid much attention. It was clear to her that the decision had already been made. Richard sat calmly, watching the trial unfold exactly the way he wanted. Emily felt small, powerless, and completely alone. Judge Howard entered the courtroom, wearing his black robe and holding some papers. He looked serious, but too familiar with Richard. Instead of acting fair and neutral, the judge often looked at Richard as if they were still friends talking in private. During the trial, Richard spoke loudly and confidently. He described Emily as someone who had once been loyal, but who became greedy. He said she took advantage of the family's trust. He used emotional language, talking about how the watch was a symbol of everything his father stood for. Although there was no solid proof, no fingerprints, no footage, no witness, Richard's version of the story was taken seriously. The few testimonies that tried to defend Emily were weak and ignored. The judge didn't ask tough questions. When contradictions appeared, no one followed up. It all felt planned. Emily stood silently, realizing that the truth didn't matter in that courtroom. After a short break, the judge returned and read the verdict. He said that the court had found Emily guilty of grand theft. The sentence was shocking: 15 years in prison. Emily gasped. She tried to say something, but the guards already started moving toward her. She couldn't believe what was happening. Tears ran down her face as she looked at the people around her, hoping someone would stop this. But everyone seemed too afraid or too blind to act. Richard showed no emotion. For him, the situation was resolved. He believed he had protected his family name and sent the right message. The courtroom was quiet, but the silence didn't feel right. It wasn't the silence of justice being served. It was the silence of something unfair being accepted. Emily was taken away, still in shock. It felt like her entire life had been erased in a single afternoon, but not everyone in the room was convinced. In the back row, Richard's 8-year-old son, Oliver, sat watching everything closely. He had been brought along by his nanny, and no one paid much attention to him, but Oliver had been listening. He remembered Emily. She had always been kind to him, bringing him snacks and helping him find lost toys. She was one of the few people in the house who treated him with real care. As he watched her cry and get taken away, Oliver felt a strange feeling in his chest. Something didn't seem right. He had never seen his father so cold. The way people avoided asking questions bothered him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that everyone had ignored something important. That day, Oliver didn't say a word, but inside, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would start paying more attention to the truth. As they left the courtroom, Richard walked ahead, proud and satisfied. He spoke briefly to the judge, thanking him for acting quickly. The staff who accompanied him stayed silent. No one mentioned Emily again. It was as if she had been erased from the family's history. But Oliver didn't forget. He kept thinking about her eyes, full of fear and confusion. He asked his nanny small questions on the way home, but she told him not to worry. Still, he couldn't stop thinking. That night, while everyone else focused on celebrating the successful outcome, Oliver stayed in his room, replaying the day in his mind. He didn't understand everything, but he felt something was wrong. The way his father controlled everything didn't feel like real justice. Emily's tears didn't look like guilt. They looked like pain. And so, even though no one noticed, Oliver quietly decided to stay alert from that moment on. After the trial ended, Emily was taken to prison. The first days were the hardest. She cried often, felt sick and barely ate. But even though she was broken inside, something in her refused to give up. She knew she was innocent. No matter how hopeless everything felt, she couldn't let Richard win with a lie. Sitting alone in her cell, she thought about her past, her life before working at the Lancaster estate. That's when she remembered Margaret. They had been childhood friends. Margaret had always been smart, curious, and brave. Years ago, she had worked for the police as a forensic expert and helped solve many serious cases. Emily hadn't seen her in a long time, but now she felt it was the only hope she had left. She wrote a letter from prison and waited. Days later, she was finally allowed a visit outside with a guard. Her destination, Margaret's cottage. Margaret lived in a small house far from the city. It was quiet and full of plants. When she opened the door and saw Emily, her expression changed immediately. Emily looked tired, thinner, and sad. And they hugged, and Emily began to cry. Inside, they sat down and talked for hours. Emily told Margaret everything about the missing watch, the rushed trial, the unfair judge, and the 15-year sentence. She explained how she never even touched the watch and had no idea it was gone until Richard accused her. Margaret listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She took notes and asked questions. Emily then mentioned a detail she had remembered recently. There was a white cloth that always sat on top of the glass case where the watch was kept. That cloth was usually used by the staff to protect the case from dust. Emily said that cloth was gone on the day of the theft. That one detail caught Margaret's attention. She leaned forward and asked more questions about the cloth. Emily said she remembered the cloth being in place the day before the theft, but the morning it was discovered missing, the cloth had vanished too. Margaret thought carefully and formed a theory. If the real thief had used the cloth to pick up or hide the watch, and if they were nervous or in a hurry, they might have cut themselves or left something behind, maybe skin cells or even a small amount of blood. That cloth could have DNA evidence. Even if the police refused to investigate, if they could find the cloth, Margaret could run her own tests. She still had some of her old equipment. Emily's eyes lit up with hope for the first time in weeks. It was a small lead, but it felt real. It felt like something they could actually use. What neither of them knew was that they weren't alone. Just outside the window, hiding behind a tree, stood Oliver. He had secretly followed Emily when he heard she was leaving the prison for a visit. He had been quiet about his suspicions since the trial, but his curiosity only grew stronger. He wanted to know more, so he decided to follow her in secret. When he saw her enter Margaret's house, he waited. The window was slightly open, and he could hear bits of their conversation. He listened as Emily talked about the cloth. The word white cloth stayed in his mind. Suddenly, something clicked in his memory. Oliver had seen that cloth before, not just once, but several times in the house. He remembered seeing it folded neatly on the shelf, and then, later, somewhere strange. He couldn't remember exactly where yet, but he knew it was important. He kept listening. As the conversation continued, Margaret explained what kind of test could be done on the cloth if they found it. She talked about DNA and how it could prove someone else had touched the watch. Emily asked how long DNA lasts, and Margaret said it depends, but if the cloth hadn't been washed or thrown away, there might still be something usable. They agreed that the first step would be to search the house or anywhere the cloth could have been moved to. Emily said she would try to remember if it ever showed up again. Margaret promised to help her no matter what. She believed Emily was innocent. They began writing down a plan. Step 1, get access to the house again. Step 2, find the cloth. Step 3, run tests. Emily felt nervous, but hopeful. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. Outside the cottage, Oliver stepped back slowly. He didn't want to get caught, but his mind was full of new thoughts. He now believed Emily even more. She didn't sound like someone who was lying. She sounded honest, scared, and desperate to prove the truth. And this thing about the cloth made too much sense. He began to replay the days around the theft in his mind. He remembered walking past the laundry room, where the maids kept all the cleaning items. That's it, the cloth. He'd seen it tossed in the corner basket near the back stairs, a place no one usually cleaned. At the time, he didn't think much of it, but now it seemed important. He looked at the house one last time and started walking back toward the main road. He had a feeling this cloth would be the key. And now he knew exactly where to look. Oliver came back home feeling nervous. His heart was beating fast. The things he had heard at Margaret's house kept playing in his mind. He knew he had to be careful. If anyone saw him acting strange, they might start asking questions. Quietly, he entered through the side door of the mansion. No one noticed him. Most of the staff were busy, and his father was probably in another room talking to guests or on the phone. Oliver walked toward his father's office. That room was usually off-limits, but he had been inside a few times before. He pushed the door slowly and stepped in. The room was quiet and filled with books and cabinets. He remembered something from earlier in the week. There was a spot behind a small wooden cabinet that people rarely touched. Slowly he moved some folders aside and opened the lower compartment. Folded neatly inside was the white cloth. He picked up the cloth with shaky hands. There was a red stain on it, dried and dark. At first it could have been wine or maybe something spilled from the kitchen. But Oliver looked closer and realized it didn't smell like food. It didn't look like any kind of drink either. That's when his memory returned sharply. A few days before the watch was reported missing, he had been playing near the back hallway when he saw his older sister, Charlotte. She was walking quickly, looking over her shoulder. In her hands, she was holding something small, wrapped in white cloth. She seemed nervous, She didn't say anything to him and rushed up the stairs. Oliver hadn't thought much about it at the time. But now, standing in the office holding what he believed was the same cloth, it all made sense. The stain wasn't just a mark, it was blood. Oliver didn't know exactly what Charlotte had done, but now he was sure Emily had told the truth. She hadn't taken the watch. Someone else had. And the person who used this cloth had left a clue behind. His sister must have gotten hurt while handling the watch. Maybe she dropped it, cut herself on the glass case, or scratched her hand on the metal. He felt a mix of emotions, fear, confusion, and anger. But most of all, he felt the need to do something. He couldn't keep this to himself. He folded the cloth back the way he found it and slipped it inside his jacket. He didn't want to leave it behind where someone could destroy it. He knew he had to get it to Margaret. She would know how to test it and prove the blood didn't belong to Emily. It was risky, but he had already made up his mind. Even though Oliver was just a boy, he understood the danger. His father had a lot of power. If Richard found out what Oliver was doing, he might get angry, maybe even punish him. Still, he didn't care. Something inside him said this was too important to ignore. Emily didn't deserve to be locked away for something she didn't do. She had always been kind and treated him like a real person, not just the boss's son. He couldn't stand knowing she was suffering while the real thief walked free. Oliver made a plan in his head. He would leave early the next morning before anyone noticed. He would take the cloth to Margaret's house, just like Emily had done. He had enough money saved from birthday gifts to pay for a taxi if needed. He also thought about what to say if someone stopped him, but he hoped no one would. That night, Oliver hid the cloth under his bed, behind a stack of books. He checked his room twice to make sure no one had followed him. During dinner, he sat at the table with his father and sister. Charlotte was quiet and didn't look at anyone. She barely touched her food. Richard talked about business meetings and future projects like nothing was wrong. Oliver stayed silent, pretending to listen. Inside, his mind was racing. He wondered what would happen if he confronted Charlotte, but he didn't feel ready. He needed proof first, real proof. He watched her carefully. She seemed tense, maybe afraid. He noticed a small bandage on her hand that she kept hiding, that only made him more certain. After dinner, he went straight to bed and set an alarm on his small digital clock. He had no idea what would happen next, but he was ready to try. The next morning, before sunrise, Oliver got dressed quietly. He grabbed the cloth, put on his jacket, and slipped out the back door. He didn't leave a note. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just walked with purpose, holding the cloth in his pocket. The streets were still empty and the air was cold. He found a taxi at the corner and gave the driver Margaret's address. On the way there, he held the cloth tightly. He didn't look out the window or speak. All he could think about was Emily and how this small piece of cloth might change everything. When the taxi stopped, he paid the driver and walked up to Margaret's cottage. He knocked on the door, and after a moment she opened it. Surprised to see him, she let him in. Oliver took the cloth from his pocket and said, "I think this will help." He felt nervous, but knew he had done the right thing. Without wasting any time, he handed it to her and explained everything. How he found it in his father's office, how he remembered Charlotte holding something wrapped in the same cloth, and how he was sure it had a bloodstain. Margaret listened carefully, taking the cloth gently and placing it on the table. She looked at Oliver with respect. "You did something very brave," she told him. She promised to keep his visit and the cloth a secret. She didn't want to alert anyone, especially not Richard. Margaret said she still had a few old contacts who worked in forensic labs. She would send the cloth to one of them privately and make sure no one traced it back to Oliver. He nodded, still feeling nervous. Later that day, Margaret carefully packaged the cloth and contacted an old friend from her forensic days. She explained the situation without using names. Her friend agreed to run the tests discreetly with no official paperwork. Margaret mailed the package under a false sender name to keep it untraceable. Back at the Lancaster estate, Oliver returned home pretending nothing had happened. He walked past his father in the hallway, who gave him a short glance. Richard noticed that Oliver seemed distracted lately, but he didn't think much of it. He figured the boy was just shaken from everything that happened with Emily. After all, it had been a scandal in the household. Richard assumed the situation would blow over eventually. What he didn't know was that Oliver had started seeing things differently. The boy didn't trust him the same way anymore. Something inside him had changed since the day of the trial. Meanwhile, Charlotte acted more and more strange. She stayed quiet at meals, spent most of her time in her room, and avoided any conversations about the stolen watch. Whenever someone even mentioned Emily, Charlotte looked down or changed the subject. Oliver noticed everything. He watched her closely but didn't say a word. He felt caught in the middle of something serious. He couldn't believe that his own sister might be involved, and his father might be covering it up, on purpose or by refusing to ask the right questions. The pressure grew inside him. He wanted to scream, but he knew it wasn't the time. Margaret had told him to be patient, to wait for the results. But patience was hard. On the television, news stories about Emily kept playing. Reporters called her a thief. Some newspapers published her photo with cruel headlines. Oliver couldn't stand watching it, but he also couldn't look away. He felt angry, sad, and confused all at once. The worst part was knowing that none of the adults seemed to care about the truth. The house staff stayed silent. His father continued with his normal life. Even his sister acted like it wasn't her fault. Every time Oliver saw Emily's name in the news, it made his stomach hurt. He had always thought adults knew what they were doing, that they were fair and smart. But now he saw something different. Adults could make mistakes. Adults could ignore the truth if it was easier. And sometimes they didn't fix their mistakes because they were too proud. It was a hard thing to learn, especially when those adults were your own family. Oliver kept thinking about all the times Emily helped him, the times she smiled at him or brought him a snack when he was sad. She didn't deserve what was happening. The days felt long. Oliver kept waiting for Margaret to call. She had told him that the DNA report would take a few days. That didn't seem like a long time, but for Oliver, every hour felt endless. He checked his phone constantly. He even thought about sneaking back to her house to see if anything had arrived, but he didn't want to risk being followed. So he waited. He stayed quiet at home, acting normal on the outside, but thinking constantly, what if the cloth really did have Charlotte's blood? What if that changed everything? What if his father still refused to believe it? These thoughts filled his head. At school, he couldn't concentrate. At dinner, he barely spoke. He started making a plan in case the DNA result came back positive. Margaret had told him to stay calm, but Oliver knew he had to be ready for what came next. He didn't want to wait for adults to decide what to do. This time, he wanted to take action. As the days passed, Oliver began to plan something bigger. If the results proved that Emily was innocent, he wasn't going to keep it private. He started thinking about how to make people listen. Maybe he could record a video or write a letter to a newspaper. Maybe he could even stand up in public and tell the truth. He wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the cloth be ignored. He wasn't going to let his sister pretend she didn't do anything, and he wasn't going to let his father hide behind his money and power. Oliver had made his choice. Even if it meant going against his family, he would stand for what was right. All he needed now was the proof, and it was coming soon. At home, Richard Lancaster began to feel that something wasn't right. For days, things had been quiet, but there was an uneasy atmosphere in the house. Richard noticed little signs, whispers in the hallway, doors being closed quickly, and Charlotte acting more distant than usual. One afternoon, while walking past the living room, he heard her voice coming from behind the door. She was talking on the phone, pacing nervously. Richard was about to call her when he stopped to listen. "What if they find out about the cloth?" she said, her voice shaky. He froze. Cloth? What cloth? He hadn't thought about it since the trial. Now, hearing this from his own daughter made his chest tighten. He stepped away quietly before she saw him. At the same time, just outside the door, Oliver was sitting silently, pretending to read, but listening to everything. He heard her words and began taking notes. Oliver quickly wrote everything down in a small notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. He didn't want to forget the exact sentence Charlotte said. It was the kind of detail that could matter later. He couldn't let emotions take over. He needed to stay focused. While he worked quietly on his notes, something else unexpected happened. A man showed up at the front door asking for Richard. It wasn't a family friend or business partner. It was an investigative journalist from a local TV station. He said he was following up on the controversial trial and had questions about the case. The butler tried to turn him away, but Richard came to the door. The journalist politely asked about missing evidence, Emily's lack of defense, and possible connections between the judge and Richard. Richard brushed it off with short answers, but he could feel the pressure rising. People were starting to pay attention. Inside his room, Oliver sat thinking. Everything was moving fast now. His sister had slipped up. The media was beginning to ask questions. His father didn't look as confident as before. Oliver waited until evening, then asked Margaret to meet again. She agreed, sensing something important had changed. They met in her garden, away from curious eyes and ears. Oliver explained what he had heard and showed her the notes he had taken. Margaret listened and nodded. Then she opened her folder and showed him something even more important. The lab had returned the DNA results from the cloth. The sample was from a female. Margaret looked him in the eyes and said clearly, "It's not Emily's." Oliver didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at the page. That was it. It wasn't just a theory anymore. He now had proof that Emily wasn't guilty, but that also meant someone else was. Oliver sat quietly, processing what Margaret had just told him. The DNA result confirmed everything he had suspected. The stain on the cloth came from a woman, but not from Emily. The only other person it could realistically be, based on what he saw and remembered, was Charlotte. That changed everything. The trial was already being questioned by the public, and now they had physical evidence. Margaret looked at him and said, "You're running out of time." That's when Oliver made up his mind. He had to act quickly. He couldn't wait for others to fix this. If he stayed silent, Emily could lose years of her life for something she didn't do. He asked Margaret to go with him to the upcoming retrial. The court had been forced to reopen the case due to growing pressure from the media and public protests. Oliver wasn't scared anymore. He had a job to do now. In the days before the retrial, Oliver helped Margaret prepare everything. They collected the test results, arranged the chain of custody, and organized all of Oliver's written notes. Margaret had worked with courts before, so she knew how to make everything official. She contacted a lawyer who was willing to speak on Emily's behalf this time. Meanwhile, Richard grew more stressed. He couldn't focus during meetings. He snapped at the staff and even yelled at Charlotte one morning. Charlotte, for her part, avoided everyone. She skipped meals and refused to go outside. The guilt seemed to be growing inside her. Oliver saw it but said nothing. He didn't want a fight. He wanted justice. He spent every free minute reviewing the facts and preparing for questions. Margaret warned him that things might get difficult in court, but Oliver didn't care. The truth was on their side now, and he was ready to speak. Finally, the day of the retrial arrived. The courthouse was full of people. Reporters waited outside with cameras. Some held signs calling for a fair trial. Inside, Emily sat quietly beside her new lawyer. Her eyes looked tired, but there was a bit of hope in them. Oliver entered the room with Margaret by his side, carrying the DNA report and his notebook. Richard, sitting in the front row, turned to look at them, clearly surprised. For a moment their eyes met. Oliver didn't look away. He knew his father was afraid now, afraid of what might be revealed. Everything was in place. The plan was simple: tell the truth, show the evidence, and finally give Emily the defense she never had. As the judge entered the room and people stood up, Oliver felt his heart racing, but not from fear. He was ready. The plan to set things right had officially begun. The day of the new hearing arrived. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters, people holding signs, and curious onlookers. There had been enough public pressure since the last trial to reopen the case. The appeal filed by the public defender, now more motivated thanks to new public support, had finally worked. This time, Oliver wasn't just a quiet observer. He was ready to speak. He stood outside the courthouse with Margaret, who had helped organize everything. Next to them was Oliver's mother, who had chosen to remain neutral during the family conflict, but now stood beside her son. She didn't say much, but her presence gave Oliver courage. As they walked inside, they saw Richard waiting with his lawyer. Richard didn't seem worried. He believed that once again, his power and connections would protect him. He gave Oliver a cold look, but the boy didn't react. Oliver kept walking, holding the cloth in his hand. Inside the courtroom, the mood was serious. Judge Howard sat at the bench, looking the same as before, calm, confident, and ready to move things along quickly. Emily entered, escorted by a guard. She looked weak, but alert. She now had a new lawyer beside her, one who had reviewed the DNA report and believed in her case. Richard sat near the front, speaking softly with his legal team. He seemed sure that nothing important would happen, that this retrial would be as easy to control as the first one. Judge Howard began the session with a neutral tone, but everyone could sense the direction things were taking. He dismissed some evidence quickly and didn't question Richard's statements. It felt familiar, like the same mistakes were happening again. People in the audience looked uneasy. The lawyer beside Emily raised objections, but the judge brushed them off. That's when Oliver stood up from his seat. Oliver stepped forward, holding the folded cloth tightly. He looked directly at Judge Howard and said, "I want to speak." The courtroom fell quiet. Everyone turned to him. Judge Howard frowned and said, "Sit down, this is not your place." But Oliver didn't move. His voice stayed calm. "I have something that proves Emily didn't do it," he said. Before the judge could respond again, Margaret stood up beside him. She spoke with a strong, clear voice. "This boy has evidence," she said. The room fell into complete silence. The judge looked unsure for the first time. Oliver stepped closer to the front and raised the cloth so everyone could see it. "This was used to steal the watch," he said. "It has blood on it, but it's not Emily's." People started whispering in the audience. Reporters leaned forward. Even Richard's face changed slightly. Oliver handed the cloth and a report to the court officer. The judge looked at the report but didn't speak right away. Margaret explained how she had sent the cloth to a private forensic lab and how the DNA test had been conducted using professional methods. The results clearly stated that the blood was from a female, but not from Emily. Emily's lawyer asked that the document be added to the official case file. Judge Howard hesitated but agreed. Richard shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something, and Richard shook his head slightly. For the first time, he looked unsure. Charlotte, seated quietly in the back, lowered her head. Oliver kept his eyes on the judge. "I asked for the test," Oliver said again, clearly and calmly. "I did it because no one else did." Margaret added, "We also have notes and witness accounts that support what he's saying." The courtroom was now silent again, but this time no one dared to interrupt. Emily's lawyer stood up and began walking the judge through the timeline of events, pointing out the flaws in the original investigation. He explained how the rushed trial had ignored basic procedures and how no one had questioned other possible suspects. He mentioned the conversation that Oliver had overheard between Charlotte and her friend, the one where she asked, "What if they find out about the cloth?" Judge Howard listened, clearly uncomfortable now. He asked the court clerk to bring up Charlotte's name from the case records. At that moment, Charlotte looked around nervously, realizing things were no longer under control. Richard's confidence began to fade. The public defender spoke up too, admitting that Emily had never been properly represented and that her version of events was never considered seriously. Everything was changing fast. The courtroom felt different now, no longer tilted in Richard's favor. For once, the truth had space to breathe. Oliver returned to his seat beside Margaret, feeling both nervous and relieved. He had done it. He had spoken up in front of everyone, even when the judge tried to stop him. Margaret gave him a small nod, proud of his courage. His mother, still sitting nearby, looked at him with quiet respect. Richard avoided looking at his son. His face was tense. He had always believed he could control the system, but this time, things were different. The judge said he needed time to review the new evidence before making a decision. The session was temporarily paused. Reporters rushed outside to deliver breaking news. Emily sat silently, tears in her eyes. Not from fear this time, but from hope. Oliver sat still, looking straight ahead. The truth was finally out in the open. The people in power couldn't hide it anymore, and with that, the truth had begun to unfold in full view. The final session resumed after a short break. Everyone returned to the courtroom with a mix of tension and curiosity. Reporters filled the back rows. Cameras were quietly rolling. The judge entered and called the court to order. The report from the forensic lab had arrived and had been verified. The judge opened the folder, looked through the results and cleared his throat. The DNA on the cloth belongs to a female, specifically Charlotte Lancaster. A collective gasp filled the room. Richard blinked, stunned. He stared at the judge, then at Charlotte. She froze in her chair. The report also explained how the cloth had been used to pick up the watch, and that the blood stain matched a fresh cut. It was evidence that couldn't be denied. Margaret was then called to the front to speak as an expert witness. She stood calmly, opened her folder, and began walking the court through everything. Margaret explained how the cloth had been found and sent to a private lab. She described in simple terms how the DNA analysis worked and how the results had been checked multiple times. She made it clear that the sample had not been tampered with and that the results were final. The stain was made during the removal of the object. The person cut themselves, possibly on glass or metal, she said. She showed illustrations and timestamps that matched Oliver's earlier timeline. It was done quickly, without gloves and without care, she added. The court listened closely. Even Judge Howard couldn't argue with the science. Margaret didn't accuse anyone by name, but her presentation pointed clearly to Charlotte. Richard sat without saying a word, his jaw tight. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as everyone looked toward Charlotte. Finally, unable to take it anymore, she stood up and spoke in a trembling voice. "I wasn't going to steal it," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to show it to my friends. I thought it was cool, and I knew no one would let me touch it." She paused and looked down. "I didn't mean to break anything. I cut my hand when I opened the case. I panicked. I didn't know what to do." Her words made the room even quieter. Emily sat in her chair, stunned. The audience began to murmur. Some were angry, others were simply shocked. Richard placed a hand over his mouth. For the first time, he didn't look powerful. He looked helpless. Charlotte continued, "I thought if I stayed quiet, it would just go away. I didn't know they were going to blame Emily." She started crying. The judge looked around nervously. Reporters whispered to one another. Some of them had already begun typing headlines to send out immediately. The judge tried to take control. He called for quiet and began reading from the court guidelines. But it was too late. The courtroom was no longer under his control. Journalists were sending live updates, and several media outlets had already confirmed the scandal on social media. The story was breaking nationally. A billionaire's daughter had caused a false conviction. A loyal housekeeper had been humiliated. A child had been the one to reveal the truth. Richard stood up, trying to speak, but the judge told him to remain seated. Emily's lawyer demanded an immediate dismissal of all charges. Judge Howard hesitated, clearly under pressure, but with the evidence, confession, and public attention, he had no choice. "The case against Emily Rivera is dismissed," he said. People clapped. Some even stood. Emily sat frozen, not sure whether to cry or smile. The guard next to her quietly unlocked her handcuffs. Justice had finally arrived. As soon as the court adjourned, the media rushed to the steps outside. Flashing lights, questions, microphones, the entire scene turned chaotic. Richard tried to leave quickly, but reporters followed him. "Why did you support a false conviction? Did you know your daughter was involved? Will you compensate Emily?" He said nothing. His security team helped him to the car. Inside, Charlotte sat beside him, crying. She didn't speak. She just stared at her hands. Emily walked out with Margaret and Oliver, surrounded by cameras and cheers. Her name had been cleared, but the damage would take time to heal. Still, there was relief in her eyes. Oliver stayed close to her side, feeling proud, but emotionally tired. The country watched everything unfold live. News programs ran special reports. Public opinion quickly turned against the Lancaster name. Their influence didn't matter now. The truth had taken control, and the people wanted answers. Richard sat silently in the back seat of the car, looking out the window. He didn't say a word to Charlotte. She had made a mistake, yes, but deep down, he knew the biggest mistake had been his. He had pushed for a fast trial. He had ignored everyone who asked questions. He had silenced the staff, pressured the judge, and refused to listen to the possibility that Emily was innocent. He had chosen pride over fairness, power over responsibility, and now everyone knew. He leaned back and stared at Oliver, sitting across from him in the car. The boy looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact, but his expression said everything. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was disappointment, a deep, painful kind that hit harder than anything else. In that moment, Richard realized something he had never felt before. He had lost his son's trust, and there was no report to fix that. The courtroom was still full when the judge officially ended the case. Reporters were still watching, cameras were still recording, and most people expected the story to end with legal consequences. Everyone assumed Emily would file a lawsuit against Richard. After all, she had every reason to do so. She had been falsely accused, humiliated in public, and sent to prison for something she didn't do. Most people in her position would be angry and ready to fight back. The lawyers began preparing papers, and the judge waited to confirm if Emily's side would take legal action. Emily stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Richard, who was still seated. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. She waited for the courtroom to quiet down. Then she spoke clearly so that everyone could hear her. "I forgive you," she said. "Life has taught me that hate only poisons us." Nobody moved, not even the judge. People looked at each other in disbelief. Emily had just walked away from an easy chance to bring down one of the most powerful men in the country, and she chose to forgive him instead. Judge Howard looked stunned. He had expected complaints, lawsuits, maybe a speech filled with blame. But this, he didn't know what to say. Even Oliver turned to Emily with surprise. Richard remained seated, looking directly at her. His eyes started to fill with tears. For the first time in his life, he cried in front of others, not out of anger or frustration, but from true regret. He stood up slowly, still shaking, and spoke with a weak voice. "I am sorry," he said, "truly sorry." He walked toward Oliver and hugged his son tightly. Then turning to Emily, he whispered, "Thank you for not destroying me." There were no loud words, no cameras flashing at that moment. Even the journalists gave them space. Emily didn't cry, and she didn't smile either. She just nodded gently. For her, forgiveness wasn't about emotion or attention. It was a personal decision. She had suffered, yes, but she wanted to move forward. She had spent enough time trapped in pain and injustice. Oliver walked to her side and held her hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It showed respect. It showed support. Emily looked at him, grateful. He had been the one who believed her when no one else did. And now, as the courtroom slowly emptied, she asked for only one thing. "I just want to live in peace," she said. "No lawsuits, no press conferences, no revenge, just a quiet life." That was all she ever wanted. The people in the courtroom began to understand that something very rare had just happened. A woman who had been wronged had chosen peace over punishment. Richard stood still, taking in every word. Something in him shifted. For years, he had used power to control, to win, and to silence others. But now, none of that had saved him. What had made the biggest difference was a simple act of kindness, forgiveness. Emily didn't need anything from him. No money, no favors, no attention. She only wanted to move on. That truth hit Richard hard. The judge, now calmer, acknowledged Emily's words in the final record and allowed her to leave with no restrictions. Margaret walked over to congratulate her. Even the court staff stood up as she passed by. Emily had entered that place as an accused criminal, but she was leaving with her dignity, her strength, and her name cleared forever. Back home, the news spread fast. Media outlets reported the unexpected ending. "Emily forgives Richard," read one headline. "Billionaire breaks down in court," said another. People across the country debated her decision. Some called her brave, others said she missed an opportunity for justice. But Emily didn't care about the public's opinion. She went home to a small apartment offered temporarily by Margaret and turned off her phone. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the street. It was quiet. That was enough for her. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his home office, thinking deeply. He looked around at everything, the furniture, the trophies, the portraits, and realized none of it meant anything if you had no peace. His daughter stayed in her room. His son barely spoke, and his reputation had changed forever. But instead of feeling crushed, he felt something new, a desire to do better, for real. The next morning, Richard made a choice, not because someone told him to, not because he feared more exposure or damage to his name, but because, for the first time, he truly wanted to change. He called his lawyer and said he wouldn't fight back if Emily ever changed her mind. He told his team to cancel all press statements. Then he asked Oliver for a quiet moment. They sat in the garden, father and son. Richard said, "I failed you. I failed her. But I want to fix what I can." Oliver didn't respond at first, but he listened. Later that day, Richard wrote a personal letter to Emily, thanking her and offering real help. No contracts, no conditions. It was a letter of respect. Emily received it, but didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that mattered, and Richard had finally heard it, for real. A week after the courtroom incident, the country was still talking. News channels, online platforms, and newspapers continued covering the story of Emily, Richard, Charlotte, and Oliver. Then something unexpected happened again. Richard called for a press conference. People expected damage control or legal explanations. Instead, Richard walked up to the microphone, took a deep breath, and made a clear statement. "I have made many mistakes," he began. "Today, I am not here to ask for forgiveness. I am here to take responsibility." He announced he would donate a significant part of his personal fortune to Emily Rivera. "This is not charity," he said. "It's justice, it's correction, and it's long overdue." The room went silent. Reporters looked at each other in disbelief. Some applauded, others asked if he was being forced to do it. "No," Richard answered. "No one made me. I need to do this for myself." And that was just the beginning. The announcement caused a national uproar. The media exploded with headlines like, "Billionaire gives fortune as justice, not pity." Some praised the gesture, calling it honorable. Others were skeptical, saying it was just a strategy to clean his image. But Richard didn't answer any follow-up interviews. He made one more public decision. He officially stepped away from his business empire. He handed over leadership to a trusted board and resigned from all executive duties. In a separate statement, he cut ties with Judge Howard and expressed support for an independent investigation into the judge's actions. Within days, Howard was suspended pending review. For Richard, this was not about reputation anymore. It was about removing himself from places where his pride had once ruled. He moved out of the Lancaster estate temporarily and chose to live quietly. When asked why, he simply said, "I need to understand life differently now." And he meant it. Emily, now legally and publicly cleared, received the funds and refused to use them for personal luxury. She had no interest in buying expensive clothes or moving into a mansion. Instead, she began working on something that had been in her heart for a long time. She used part of the money to open a training school for women in difficult situations, those who had lost jobs, escaped domestic violence, or had no support. The place would offer free classes, housing, and counseling. She named it Oliver's Institute to honor the boy who had risked everything to tell the truth. When she told Oliver about the name, he didn't know what to say. He simply smiled and hugged her. The community reacted with excitement. Volunteers joined, professionals offered to help, and women from across the country applied. Emily's vision wasn't just about recovery. It was about dignity, skills, and independence, a place where justice meant opportunity. At first, Richard stayed away. He didn't want his presence to confuse things. He didn't want people to think Emily's project belonged to him. But after some time, he started visiting the institute anonymously. He used a fake name and signed up as a quiet volunteer to help clean the classrooms and serve food. Emily recognized him immediately, but she said nothing. She let him come and learn. He never asked for special treatment. He followed the rules, mopped floors, and listened to the classes. Slowly, something began to change in him. He met women who had suffered things he couldn't imagine. He sat through talks on resilience, failure, and rebuilding. He never gave speeches. He just watched, listened, and helped. One day, someone asked who he was. Emily smiled and said, "Someone who's learning." That became his role. No longer the man in control. Now just a person trying to understand life again. Meanwhile, Emily began teaching a course at the Institute called Ethics and Dignity. It was a small class, held twice a week, where she talked about choices, respect, and the value of truth. She used her own story as a lesson, not to seek pity, but to show others that life can go on after injustice. She reminded the women that silence in the face of lies is dangerous, and that courage doesn't always look loud. Some students were shy, others angry at the world. Emily guided them patiently. She reminded them that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring what's right. Oliver sometimes visited after school. He helped record videos and take photos for the Institute's website. By now, he was a teenager, but his sense of right and wrong hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown stronger. He still didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. On the one-year anniversary of the Institute, a small event was held. Students shared stories, families visited, and a few local news channels came to cover the day. Near the end, Emily asked Oliver to speak. He didn't prepare a long speech. He simply stood in front of a camera and said, "Justice doesn't come from power. It comes from choosing what's right, even when you're small." The room fell silent. That one sentence summed up everything the journey had been about. People clapped, not because he sounded like a leader, but because he spoke the truth. Richard stood in the back, wiping his eyes without anyone noticing. Emily stood beside Oliver, placing a hand on his shoulder. That moment wasn't about titles or money. It was about change, real change, the kind that starts small and grows through action. And so the story didn't end. It continued, one honest choice at a time. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.